Hey guys, so I have the right answer put in here already because I did it once and then I had this flipped for some reason. I typed 2 over pi instead of pi over 2, and then I was like, oh no, what did I do wrong? Anyway, it was a whole thing, so I have like the explanation, but I'm not going to be using that. I'm just going to be explaining what I did. Um, so we'll do it over again, but I just already have this written here. Anyway, so starting at the beginning, I should say. This is the general form of a sine function. So I have my amplitude, I have my midline, and then I'm going to use um, both B and C to get my phase shift. So let's talk about that for a second. So phase shift is just a fancy way of saying moving right to left. So that's all it is. It's that right-left movement, which usually we just add or subtract something here to get that. But it's a little bit more complicated, so I'm going to show you what that is. So bx plus c, if I factor out the b, I'm going to have bx plus c over b. This c over b is my phase shift. So c over b is the phase shift. So there's going to be several ways of thinking about this. First of all, they've told you that they want you to use sine. If you look at this graph, hopefully you think, oh, that's cosine because it starts at the maximum. But they've told you to use sine, so we're forced to use this phase shift. So we could make an equation for this with cosine. We wouldn't have to use a phase shift at all. But we're told to use sine, so we're forced to use the phase shift. We're given that this is where we cross the midline, so that's where this number comes from. So that's kind of the easy part, right? We're given that we cross the midline at this point, so that y value is going to be our midline. We're given a maximum, so the distance, this y distance here between the maximum and the amplitude is, maximum and the midline is the amplitude. So negative 6.5 minus negative 2 is negative 4.5, but amplitudes are absolute values, so it's positive 4.5. So that is where that number comes from. So those are kind of the easy parts, right? I'm just given my midline, negative 2 to negative 6.5, that distance is 4.5. So just subtract them to get that. So that's pretty straightforward. And then I have to figure out my period and my shift. So the period is actually pretty easy because I know that this maximum is at 2. Nope, this maximum is at 0. I was looking at that too. This maximum is at 0 and this maximum is at 4. So that my period is from 0 to 4. So I can look at maximum to maximum or minimum to minimum. So I could look at from 2 to 6, right? And I would still see that my period is 4. So my period is 4. So I'm going to write that down. Period is 4. That means that 2 pi over b is 4. And that is, in fact, this b here, even though I made it capital for some reason. So this b is 4. And so b, if I rearrange that equation, is 2 pi over 4, right? Because I'm multiplying by b and then dividing by 4. So I get 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2. Again, had that last couple of examples. Pi over 2. So b is pi over 2. So I can look at this. I know that this is my phase shift. So I need to figure out what my phase shift needs to be. There are multiple ways of doing this. But basically I'm looking for what point would be my starting point for this graph. So what point in a regular sine graph without a phase shift, what point would be on the y-axis? So that would be a point that's at the midline where you're going to go from the midline up. Because if it's going from the midline down, that would be a negative sine function. So if I chose this as my starting point, I could do that, but I would have to have a negative in front here. I'm going to choose this as my starting point. So basically what I'm saying is this is a midline. This is where it crosses the midline. So if this were here, then there would be no shift. So I'm saying, okay, this graph has been shifted left by 1. Now, left is a positive c, just like we've done in other function types. Left is positive and right is negative. So left is a positive c. So our shift is going to be positive 1, 1 to the left. I could choose this as my point. I didn't, but I could. I could choose this as my point, right? Because it's at the midline going up. So I could say left 1, or I could say right 3. So my negative 3 would be my shift. I could say negative 7 is my shift. Any of those would work. They would give me the exact same graph. I'm going to use 1. 1 is my shift. So I'm saying that this c over b is 1. So b is pi over 2. I know that. So pi over 2 is x times x plus 1. So I'm just going to distribute that pi over 2. So pi over 2 x plus pi over 2. So that is where this came from. So if I had this equation and I was trying to find my phase shift, I would do this divided by this. When I'm trying to find this, I use the fact that b times x plus the phase shift is what goes here, and I just distribute to get what goes in my parentheses. Because we want this form, not this form, this form. So once I find my shift, I have to distribute b. Hopefully that makes sense. I'll do another example. So let's go ahead and go to the next question. But yeah, in fact, Khan Academy used plus 3, which I found out because I made a mistake and I had to actually look at what they did. So theirs actually looks like this. It looks different. It's minus 3 pi over 2 instead of plus pi over 2. But because those things are 2 pi apart, remember if I add or subtract 2 pi, it doesn't change anything. So since plus pi over 2 and minus 3 pi over 2 are 2 pi apart, then these two equations are exactly the same. So theirs says minus 3 pi over 2. Mine says plus pi over 2. Those are the exact same equation because this point are exactly 1 period apart. Okay, let's move on. All right, so in this one, we are given the equation and we're graphing it. Sorry, I was confused for a second because there wasn't an input box. Yeah, sorry about that. So in this one, we're graphing it. So first, we're going to look at the equation and find all of our pieces. So we need amplitude, we need midline, we need period, and we need the phase shift, which is our right to left movement, right? So amplitude is easy, 0.5. 0.5. Midline, also easy, y equals -2. period is 2 pi divided by this thingy. 2 pi, or times its reciprocal, right? So times 3 over pi, which is 6. Period is 6. And the phase shift is going to be this divided by this. So I'm going to multiply by the reciprocal. So it's going to be 4 pi over 3 times 3 over pi. 4 pi over 3 times 3 over pi, multiplying by the reciprocal. If this wasn't a fraction, I would divide, right? But since it's a fraction, I'm going to multiply by the reciprocal, which is the same thing as dividing. The 3 is going to cancel, the pi is going to cancel, so the phase shift is going to be 4. Fantastic. So I have all my information. I have my amplitude, my midline, period, my phase shift. So a regular sine function, if this were just a regular sine function, it would start here at 0. It's not a regular sine function. So how is that going to change? Well, first of all, it's going to move down 2, right? Just going to move this so it'll let me move this down 2. So it's going to move down 2. Oopsies. That's the midline, right? And it's going to move which direction? 4. Well, it's positive, so it's going to move left 4. So we're moving over here to negative 4. So this is my new starting point, is over here at negative 4. And then my amplitude is a half. So to get from negative 2 up a half is going to be negative 1.5. Remember, negative 2 plus the amplitude, so negative 2 plus a half is negative 1.5. So that's my amplitude, and then my period is 6. So again, from the starting point to the maximum, back to the midline, to the minimum, back to the midline is 1 period. So this would be 6, which makes this 3, which makes this 1.5. Basically, it's 6 divided by 4. It's the period divided by 4 is where the maximum would be. So period divided by 4 is the maximum, which is going to be 1.5. So I'm going to move this. It's at the right height, right? Negative 1.5. And then, so this is 1.5 from 0. That's important, right? If this is from going from 0 to 6. So this is 1.5 from 0, which means it needs to be 1.5 from our starting point, which is negative 4. So 1.5 from negative 4 is here at negative 2.5. So you do negative 4 plus 1.5. That would give you negative 2.5. To check, you could find 1 period away. So 1 period away would be here. We're at 2. Negative 4 to 2 is in fact 6. So our period is accurate. Yay! All right. This is cosine. So let's go ahead and do this example as well. This is cosine. So normally our maximum would be on the y. So our maximum is going to be our starting point. We're not given the midline, we're given the maximum and the minimum. So we can find the midline by taking the average of these two, average of the maximum and minimum. So let's go ahead and get our midline. So negative 9 plus 6 divided by 2 is negative a half. Nope, negative 1.5. That's actually what I was thinking when I said negative a half. It's negative 1.5. So that is our midline is at negative 1.5. So I'm just gonna make notes again. So again, this is gonna be cosine, and the midline is at negative 1.5. So that is gonna be there. Okay. So then the next question is, what is our amplitude? So our amplitude is going to be the distance from the midline to the maximum. So that's going to be negative 1.5, or actually 6 minus negative 1.5. Sorry, other way around. 6 is our maximum, so it's going to be 6 minus negative 1.5, which is going to be 7.5. That's going to be our amplitude. So that goes here, 7.5. So we have the midline, we have the amplitude, and now we need to figure out what our period is. So our period is going to be from peak to peak, or from minimum to minimum. So let's go ahead and do maximum to maximum because those fall on the line. So that's going to be easier. So it's from 3 to 10. So that's going to be 7. So our period is 7. So if I already have my pen. Sorry. So period is 7. So B is going to be 2 pi divided by 7. See the previous example for how that works. So I'm just going to leave that as 2 pi over 7 because that doesn't really simplify. And then, so I'm going to have 2 pi over 7 x, and then I'm going to have my shift here. So let's figure out what the shift is going to be. So this is cosine, and the maximum is here, so this is where we start. So it got shifted 3 to the right. So I'm going to minus 3, right? Because I'm moving 3 to the right. So I'm going to subtract 3 going to the right because my maximum would have been here without a shift. It's moved 3 to the right. So this is my shift. And so I just need to distribute that. So I have 2 pi over 7 x minus 6 pi over 7. And so that's what goes here. 2 pi over 7x minus 6 pi over 7, parentheses. So this would be my final answer. So that's going to be what I would put here. So I have 7.5. It's my amplitude, cosine 2 pi over 7x minus 6 pi over 7 minus 1.5. And there we go. So that is how you make an equation with a shift from a graph. So we've done sine, now we've done cosine. You could make it negative, but you never have to. So like even no matter like where this maximum was, I could do a shift such that the maximum is what moves here. I could have just shifted it one to the, or a half, right? I could have shifted it a half to the left and made it negative cosine. I'm allowed to do that, but I never need to, right? Or I could have shifted it 6.5 to the right and made it negative. But I don't have to do that. I can always keep it positive. Sine or cosine, I can always keep it positive by shifting the correct, by just choosing which point I'm shifting from the y-axis. All right, well, I hope that helps, and let me know if you have any questions.